Senator Rubio, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. I heard my friends in Vegas told me you were there.
Yeah, the odds were that I was out there. Now, I've got your book, American Son, which is coming out
Yep.
on the 19th here today, and I did not know this. I did not know that you lived in Las Vegas for a short
I
period
did,
of time.
and that's why I mentioned that to start our program. I actually lived there for 6 years. My dad was a bartender in Miami Beach for the most part, and when things went kind of sour there, moved us out west at a time when Vegas was not what it is today. And I know it sounds kind of strange, but my parents were looking for a more wholesome environment for us, so they moved us to Las Vegas. But outside of the Strip, it was still a pretty small community, and I have very fond memories of our time living there.
It's actually a really nice town, outside of the Strip, outside of the really garish areas of the Strip, which are fun, of course. Obviously, a lot of Americans go there for enjoyment, but it's actually a pretty tight little community out there in Las Vegas. And I lived in Arizona, I lived in California, so I'm a little bit more familiar with Las Vegas. And yeah, no, I mean it's a really interesting, it's an interesting detour in your life. What did you learn from the period of time that you were in Las Vegas?
Well, again, the book details a couple things. Number one is formative years, because our grandfather would live with us, and so he would sit out on the porch every day, smoke one of his 3 daily cigars, and talk to me often about history. But he loved history. He read a lot, and of course, through history, obviously, invariably, it involved political figures. And I think a lot of the worldview that I have today and my view of politics really began to emerge and be formed during that time by my grandfather's view of the world and the impressions he had about America's role in all of that. So I think that was a part of growing up there. The other is I grew up in a very diverse environment. Obviously in a community where many of the kids there were either involved in the Air Force Base or parents worked like my parents did in the service sector in the hotels, and it was really the ultimate working class community of people that were trying to provide a life for their families and opportunities for their kids that they didn't have. And so that was a valuable growing experience as well. And then during our time there, of course, we had lost my grandfather.
Right.
Talk about in the book, people may not realize this, but I actually walked the picket line with my dad. He was part of the culinary union that went on strike, and we walked the picket line with him, and obviously that didn't turn out well in the long term, and it was one of the things that I think precipitated our move back to Miami, among others. So I have both very fond memories of that time in my childhood.
And it's interesting that you bring that up. I mean, obviously, the unions are always always politically relevant. They're always involved in policy and in electoral politics. And there's a perception that Republicans don't know anything about unions, don't have any connection to unions. A culinary union is a private sector union. It's not a public sector union. It's not like the SEIU or AFSCME. And most Republicans I know have no problem with private sector unions as long as the workers are the ones that are initiating that. How do you feel about that? What was that experience like, and what did that inform you about unions?
Well, there are two lessons that I took from the strike and the story I talk about in the book. The one was very personal, and that is the pragmatic decisions that our parents have to make. I was very mad at my dad when he had to go back to work. The strike kind of fell apart at the end. He stopped taking me to the picket line because it started getting violent, and then he had to go. Eventually, they broke the union, and he had to go back and work. And when he got back, all the people that had gone in before him had the better jobs, the better shifts, the better pay, and I think that one of the reasons that we moved. But so when he made that decision, I was mad at him. I was very mad at him. I called him a scab because that's the words that I heard thrown around on the picket line. And I realize now that he had to make a very painful but grown-up decision. He had to feed his family. I mean, he had to pay the bills. And in life, sometimes you're forced to make those kinds of difficult decisions. The bigger picture, look, I think that workers in America do have a right to organize, but they have to also understand that there has to be the private sector. There has to be an employer. Someone is risking their money in business. And the reason why my dad was able to feed us and ultimately provide us opportunities is because someone took a chance at opening up a hotel, and there was no guarantee that hotel would work. But it did, and because it did, and because people had enough money to fly to Las Vegas and leave tips at the bar, my dad was able to raise us and provide for us. And we have to respect that too. And I think sometimes when people talk about unions and the right to organize, they forget that there's another side of the equation, and that's an employer. And the fact that, and that's why I'm glad that I live in a right-to-work state like Florida, where workers have a right to organize, but at the same time, workers it's ultimately in the hands of the workers and the employer, not the union boss.
Right. And it's a completely voluntary association in a right to work state.
That's correct.
You talked about your grandfather, and your family story is fascinating. You and I have discussed it before. The Cuban community in exile in the United States and the experiences that have come with that. Tell us a little bit how your grandfather helped form. Gave you those stories, helped form the politics that is the basis of your career now.
Well, as my grandfather first came to the U.S. in 1956, and when Fidel Castro won, he, like millions of other Cubans, was enthusiastic about what that could mean. I mean, Fidel didn't admit he was a communist at the time. He was claiming they were going to have elections. And so he went back to Cuba and actually went to work there and reincorporated into society there, and then things went sour. And I think what that left him with for the rest of his life is two things. Number one is a deep disdain for what communism meant, because communism wasn't just a system of government, it was the actions that these people took. Where they made all these enormous promises to society, but then the price of those promises, which, by the way, they didn't keep, was your liberties, your freedoms, your independence as a people and as a nation. And he was very bitter about that, and he understood that the only thing that stood in the way of that happening in other countries was the U.S. clearly being the opposition to that. I think the second thing that he was really convinced of after leaving there and coming to the U.S. is that, and again, I'm talking, I was 13 years old when he passed away, so some of this is looking back in hindsight. I think the other impact that it had on him that he kind of communicated to me over the years and the different lessons and things that he would talk about is, be careful when you turn too much of your hopes and dreams over to individuals or to government or to political figures. Because at the end, what you really need is the liberty and the freedom to fulfill your own ambitions, not to surrender your security and your freedoms to somebody else so they could claim to provide it for you. And I think that maybe as a younger man he didn't fully understand it, but I think the experience of having lived in a communist country and having to escape it really had that a profound impact on him. And I think that's why he became such an enormous fan of Ronald Reagan. And inculcated that in me, because Reagan understood how important America was to the world, but he also understood that at the end of the day, what we were going to accomplish in life should be a product of our hard work and our good ideas and our merit, not our political leaders.
Again, your book is An American Son, and you are a first-generation American. This is your family is we've just been discussing the emigrated to the United States in seeking freedom, which is of course a story that millions and millions and millions of American families have in their own backgrounds, and immigration is always a difficult issue in American politics, and Republicans, like you and I, are sometimes perceived as being anti-immigrant because of the policies that we prefer on immigration control and border security. What does your book have to say about that, and how do you rebut the charge that Republicans are anti-immigrant?
Well, first of all, I remind people that immigration is not a black and white and I think sometimes issue, and sometimes I think both sides, but I think particularly the left is really guilty of simplifying it or positioning the issue in a way that totally tries to delegitimize the other side of the debate. Yeah. The truth is, as I talk about in the book, that on the one hand, these are human beings, and the vast majority of whom are here searching for a better life. They came for the same reasons our ancestors came, because they wanted to provide their children and their families a better life. And we have to be compassionate and understanding of that. On the other hand, this is the most generous country in the world when it comes to immigration. About 1 million people a year come to this country from all over the world in search of a better life. No other nation does that or even comes close. And there is also consequences, economic, political, social, to illegal immigration. And there is a reasonable frustration that exists across this country that illegal immigration hasn't been dealt with or solved. And that's a valid concern, too, that too often doesn't get enough attention. And in fact, when you bring it up, you're characterized as some sort of anti-immigrant hater. So I think both sides need to catch themselves and realize that we do have an issue here. It has to be responsibly confronted. Yes, these are human beings, and we should be compassionate towards them. But we also can't be the only country in the world that does not enforce its immigration laws. And finding that kind of nuanced but principled approach to immigration is a little more difficult to do than it has been in the past. And I think it's only going to get more difficult to do when the president does the things that he did on Friday, where he basically ignores the Constitution and imposes a short-term solution on our society.
I was going to ask you about that, because I know that you've been working on building bipartisan support for a a middle of the road approach to some of the same issues that President Obama brought up on Friday.
Right.
And I don't want to necessarily take too much time here because we want to focus on your book, An American Son. But was that helpful in building a bipartisan consensus, or has that really hampered your ability?
That's hampered it. And
Yeah.
look, that's again what I talk about in the book consistently during my campaign. I mean, I ran on strong conservative principles, but I recognize that there are young people in this country who were brought at a very young age, who through no fault of their own are undocumented, who have a lot to contribute to our future. And I said we should figure out a way to accommodate them, but we have to do it in a way that's responsible. And that's why we have a republic, and that's why we have a Congress, so you can take input from all sides, so you can work through some of these issues. And that takes time. There's no way to quickly wrap that up. When the president takes a unilateral action like this, he ignores the Constitution and ignores the Congress. Not only should that bother us just from a constitutional perspective, but from a policy perspective, he took no input from anybody in terms of what impact this is going to have on the future. And I think if any negative stories result from his new policy, it's going to make it even harder to find a long-term solution to this problem. So I think in the short term, I understand that this will be welcome news for some of these kids that are desperate for an answer. But I'm telling you, my biggest fear is that in the long term, this is going to make it very, very hard now to find the kind of responsible solution that most of us have been searching for. And that's why I think it's counterproductive.
How much consultation did you get from the White House prior to, or did you?
None.
None. They didn't consult you at all. They knew that you were working on this, right?
No, absolutely not.
It's
no.
amazing.
The only thing I know the White House has ever done on this issue is what I've read about in the newspapers is they brought in a bunch of DREAM Act kids and ordered them not to work with us on this issue at all.
Wow.
I found out about this issue and this decision from the press, and again, but I think that what that shows, what some of the motivations were behind this, and but look, moving forward, what really concerns me is that when you ignore the Constitution and the Congress and create important law like this by fiat and executive order, you are really setting back the ability of this process to find, and of this society to find a reasonable solution.
I agree with you completely. Now, we don't have very much time left. I know you're very busy talking to other people, but I want to ask you one last question. This book is a balance of your personal life, politics, policy, philosophy. What is the one big takeaway that you want people to get from An American Son?
I think the one big takeaway is that when my parents, like your parents and everyone's parents, were young, they were just like we were. They had hopes, they had dreams for themselves. For my parents, it became impossible for a lot of different reasons. And so the purpose of their life became to give me the chance to do all the things they couldn't. And I owe a lot of that. I owe all of that to God's blessings and to my parents' hard work. But I recognize that had I not been an American son, none of these things would be possible. The reason why things have been possible for me that weren't possible for my parents is because I was born a citizen of the single greatest nation in all of human history. And so this book is as much a tribute to America as it is an individual tribute to my parents, because only in this country would the story I wrote about in that book be possible. And the challenge for this generation is to ensure that that dream lives on for future generations.
Indeed. Senator Marco Rubio, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.